Skalbroken, a short story by M.T. Zimny, narrated by Elizabeth Phillips. If it weren't for the 5-week-old newborn strapped to my chest, it would be just like any other job. Hero cooed into my tunic, nestling her fuzzy head into the dark folds of the brown fabric. I tightened the wrap that held her in place and gave her a tentative pat. Her belly was full, and she was due for a nap, so as long as I didn't jostle her too much, she would stay asleep long enough for me to complete the coming task. It would be fine, I told myself. Plenty of the other mercenaries I knew had children. Granted, they'd found theirs the traditional way. What mercenary worth their skull hadn't, at some point, come across an orphan child in need and subsequently took them in as their own? What mercenary other than me, of course? I'd had to make my own child. A sharp breeze cut through the leather of my armor, and I adjusted Hero's wrap to better protect her from the midnight wind. My short hair left my neck vulnerable to the night air, and if I was cold, I worried Hero would be cold too. We need to go. I strode forward to meet Davin and my client at the lip of the bluff, where they surveyed the moonlit wasteland below us. In the light of the 2 moons, I counted at least 3 Rotsbane roaming across the barren land in search of Skal to sate their endless hunger. You should have left your lady back in Riverstead, Skullbreaker. My client, the Grand Baron's personal architect, gave a low chuckle that made his jowls waggle. I placed a protective hand over Hero's head that had nothing to do with the nighttime chill. I didn't usually let my clients tag along on the jobs they hired me for, but the architect had built the labyrinth we'd be breaking into, and only he knew the way to the vault at its center. Can you blame her? Davin forced a booming laugh that reverberated through his broad chest. Runa's been holed up at home since the little one came along. It's a nice break for them both. He caught my eye, and I played along with a wan smile. It wasn't often that I let my husband join me on my skull-breaking jobs either, but he was the face of the business. Men didn't like hiring women skull-breakers, and if the architect was joining me tonight, that meant Davin had to come too, to keep our charade safe and the money flowing. And after a long pregnancy and 5 weeks of caring for Hero, the money needed to start flowing again. We were down to our last pennies. Where's the entrance from here? I looked to the architect. He wasn't a terribly old man, nor was he oversized in any sense of the word, but something about the skin of his face and neck and the way his yellow scholar's robes hung off his frame gave the impression that he was melting. A grin split that image, revealing the gap between his front teeth, and he held a knobby-knuckled hand up to point into the wastelands. You said it was near the wastelands, I hissed. Not in them. I know what I told the Skullbreaker, he simpered. I'm certain I was clear that we'd be entering the labyrinth from within the canyon. I'd listened in on his conversation with Davin when he'd come to hire me very carefully. I knew what he had said, and I knew he was now lying through his gapped teeth. This was supposed to be safe. I jabbed him in the chest with a finger, and Davin tried to draw me back. I brought my child. There's at least 3 Rotsbane within the mile. The light of the dual moons turned the flat, dusty land that stretched below us silver, making the shifting shadows of hungry Rotsbane easy to see where they paced and howled. Then you and the little one can wait up here while we do the hard work. If your husband is as talented at skull-breaking as he claims, it won't take us long. The architect made a show of lifting a bronze sextant to measure the angle of the moons. But you're right about one thing. We need to move quick. The entrance can only be found by the light of a dual full moon at a very specific hour, and they're just about in place. I looked at the sky. The light of the moons had chased the starlight from the heavens. It would be months before their phases lined up again, and we would have a second chance at breaking into the labyrinth. Runa and the child will be fine. Davin squeezed my shoulder, then unhooked a leather belt at his waist. Glowing bottles of Skal clinked together where they hung off the belt, and he stowed it in the roots of a gnarled tree. Best leave our Skal, though, with the Rotsbane so close. The architect smiled again and pulled 2 vials of glowing Skal from within his yellow robes.
But of course.
He added his Skal to Davin's store. He looked at me expectantly, and I patted my hips to show I wasn't carrying Skal to begin with. While most magicians relied on drinking the liquid to use their creation magic, my skills relied on the magic that already existed in the doors I broke and unlocked. I didn't need Skal. The architect didn't know this, of course, but he looked satisfied.
Shall we?
He turned to the lip of the bluff, his light, wispy hair fluttering in the wind. A steep set of steps had been carved in the stone of the cliff face, and while the architect led the way, Davin stayed 2 steps ahead of me.
Are you all right?
He whispered so that the architect wouldn't hear.
I don't like this,
I hissed back.
How do we know there's even a Skal spring in the vault? If we go through all this, risk Hero for nothing. I meant, are you well?
He peered back at me over his broad shoulders, his eyes wrinkling in concern over his neat brown beard. We both knew 5 weeks was not long enough to heal from childbirth.
I told you, I'm fine.
If I said it enough times, it would have to be true. The ache in my legs would have to disappear, and the pain in my abdomen would ebb away with it. I'd healed better and faster than most women I knew, yet it still wasn't enough. I was still trapped in a stranger's body.
But the Rotsbane, they'll leave us alone as long as we don't have any Skal. Unless they tear us apart in search of it. And what about the return journey? I asked. After we've filled our water skeins and vials? Then we'll wait in the labyrinth until daybreak and the Rotsbane leave. Or we'll sacrifice a bit of Skal for a distraction.
I fantasized for a moment about soaking my client in the magic-imbued liquid and setting him loose in the wasteland to make him my distraction. We wouldn't need him at that point anymore, after all. Hero wriggled against my chest, and I patted her back with one hand while I braced the other against the clay of the cliff wall. The stairway was narrow, and it was difficult to watch my footing with the baby obscuring my view of the steps directly underfoot. Not a baby. My baby. But as much as I loved Hero, she was still very much a stranger. And this job would be a lot easier if I didn't have to worry about her. This would be easier if I hadn't given birth just over a month ago. This job would be a lot easier if I was still me. A Rotsbane's howl cut through my thoughts. The sound was horrible, like bitter wind grating against serrated stone, or as if the creature was trying to swallow its own screams. A shadow lurched across dry, cracked land, headed towards our stairway. It was still far off, but its progress was too deliberate. It knows we're here. I spoke loud enough for the architect to hear my warning.
Then go and wait for your husband like a good wife,
the architect yelled back. He quickened his pace, stumbling down the steps.
The moons are just about in position. If you want your Skal, you'll hurry.
Davin hesitated to look back at me, waiting for my instruction. His tunic was stained with fish oil, and though he had leather bracers, he was otherwise unarmored. Despite his sturdy build, he was made for fishing, not for mercenary work.
Keep going,
I said through gritted teeth.
But Hero,
I've got her, and like you said, we have no Skal. The Rotsbane won't bother us. But the monster's trajectory was unmistakable. Maybe it could smell the bottles we'd left up on the bluff, or maybe there were traces of Skal left on our clothes. I'd fought a Rotsbane before. I'd been in peak physical condition, and it still hadn't been pleasant. Frustration rolled over me as I ran down the stairs after Davin. Any other mission, and this would have been fine. Any other mission, and I would have welcomed the extra challenge. We hit the floor of the canyon in a sprint. The architect was faster than I would have thought, and his robes billowed out behind him as he ran. His boots kicked up dust, and Davin and I followed him farther into the wastelands. The horizon was obscured by the wall of the far cliffs that rose toward the 2 moons. 3 peaks jutted higher than the rest, each casting 2 shadows across the wasteland, and I realized where the architect was leading us. The 6 shadows crisscrossed in an array that left a single patch of moonlight lit in their center. That was why we needed the full light of both moons glowing from specific angles in the sky. Otherwise, the wrong patch of dusty barren ground would be lit, and the entrance to the labyrinth would remain hidden. "There!" I pointed it out to Davin and then sprinted ahead. I clutched Hero to my chest, hoping she'd stay asleep, but already feeling her fight the confines of her wrap. I overtook the architect, who shouted something at my back, but I couldn't hear it over the wailing of the approaching rotsbane. It mixed with the sound of Hero crying against my chest, and I couldn't tell which set my nerves on end more. I was a bad mother. I never should have come here. I never should have had Hero. She deserved more. And so did I. I urged my legs to go faster. I hadn't ran in so long. I didn't remember it making it so hard to breathe. I passed into the shadow of the peaks and took comfort in the sound of Davin thundering close behind me. Dust billowed upwards as I skidded to a stop in the moonlit circle. It was roughly the size of our town center, and I reached up to flick tinted goggles down over my eyes, casting the dust and dirt that surrounded us in a green pallor. Davin did the same, though his was just for show. I would be the one manipulating Skal. Hero wailed, the rotsbane howled, and the architect screamed as he chased us. I ignored them all, falling to my knees and digging my fingers into the dust. Grains of dirt slipped under my fingernails, and I pressed my palms into the hard ground beneath. Here in the wastelands, most Skal was devoured by the rotsbane, who roamed the dust between the canyon walls. It would make finding the Grand Baron's hidden door easy. Traces of creation magic reverberated through each particle of dirt, weak but definitely there. Whoever had made this door had done a good job. It resisted my prying fingers. "Runa," Davin warned overhead. "I know," I murmured. I could feel each thread of the invisible door, carefully and deliberately woven into place by a skilled magician. I just had to undo it at the right spots, loosen a thread here, unknot a bit of magic there. "Let us pass through," I urged the door as Skal magic buzzed through my fingertips. The dust around my hands started to glow. "Let us in." "The rotsbane! I know, Davin!" Fresh, unformed Skal was easy to use and wield, requiring little will and little imagination, but it took a special skill set to overcome another magician's creation, to force a new will upon the Skal that built it. Skalbreakers weren't made. We were born. And I used to be so good at it. The door should have given way by now. I'd spent the last 5 weeks wondering if the person I'd been before motherhood had died in the birthing chair. What if I was right? What if I was someone new entirely? Someone who could no longer bid Skal to undo itself? I looked up at Davin and froze. The architect had caught up to us, but the rotsbane was bearing down behind him. It was monstrous in height, and its sunken eyes glowed a dim green from where they sat within a skull made of shadows. 4 dark, clawed arms reached out for us, and its humanoid jaw unhinged as it searched for Skal in the air. Its howl was ear-splitting this close, drowning out the sounds of Hero's cries and the architect's screams. Davin stepped between me and the beast, pulling a metal dagger from a sheath at his belt. I had failed us. My wrists sank beneath the hard earth as the will of the magician who'd made this door gave way to my skull breaking. Moonlight snuffed out, and I tumbled through stale, open air. The sound of the rotsbane's howl cut, but Hero's angry cries were just as piercing. I staggered to my feet, shushing her and patting her back as she thrashed inside her wrap. Dull light emanated from the architect, illuminating the low ceiling and casting shadows up Davin's ruddy face, but it was difficult to make out much else in the shadow. "You should have left the woman at home, Skalbreaker." The architect's low growl held no sign of the panicked screams he'd displayed above ground in the face of the rotsbane. "She's clearly a distraction. That thing nearly had me." Davin whirled on the architect, holding his dagger against the man's sagging throat. Davin pushed the folds of the architect's robes aside, revealing the single glowing bottle of Skal that provided the little amount of light we had. "If that rotsbane had killed you, it would have been your own damn fault." Davin ripped the bottle from the architect's belt. "I said to leave the Skal behind." Hero's cries subsided to a whimper, and she burrowed back against my tunic. My heart hammered against her warmth, and I flexed my fingers. The air down here buzzed with the remnants of skull magic. There would be more invisible doors ahead.
"We'll need the skull to light our path."
The architect snatched the glowing bottle back from Davin, uncorked it, and downed half its contents. He smacked his lips and pulled the goggles that hung around his neck into place over his eyes. A burgundy flame flickered to life in the palm of his hand, and he pressed it against an alcove in the wall. The fire flared white and traveled along an inlet carved halfway up the stone walls. It illuminated us in a ring of bright light, and I adjusted Hero's wrap to keep her settled in the dark folds of my tunic. We stood at the top of a stone ramp that sloped downwards for several yards before leveling off and disappearing into the mouth of a corridor. Flickering white light danced from the hall, indicating that the architect's skull flame continued to burn out of sight.
"Ready, Skalbroken?"
A new hunger coated the architect's words, and he led the way down the slope at an eager pace. Davin's eyes were still obscured by the tinted goggles that protected his eyes from the skull's firelight, but I returned the look he gave me, hoping he could read the silent message I tried to instill in the glance. I do not trust the architect. The slightest nod of Davin's head and the stern set of his jaw beneath his beard told me he both understood and agreed with the message. The corridor widened where the slope leveled off, and white flames washed out the dark gray stone of the walls and floor. The architect's yellow robes were hard to look at in the harsh shifting light, but I tracked his progress ahead of us as he banked left at the first fork. I tapped Davin's arm as we followed, and he nodded. I may have been the expert skullbreaker, but Davin was a quick thinker. We would need a way to navigate the labyrinth without the help of the architect if things went sideways.
"Distract him,"
Davin growled. So, I called after the architect, trying to come off as casual. What sort of treasure is so precious that the Grand Baron would bury it under the wastelands? The architect's jowls wobbled as he twisted back to look at me. That hungry set to his brow above his goggles had yet to leave his face, and his lips split into another toothy grin.
"Don't you worry," he chortled. "There will be plenty of skull for you and the Skalbroken, as agreed upon. Put the other treasures out of your mind. Those are for me, and me alone."
He turned right down an adjoining corridor. Davin's dagger whispered against its leather sheath. Metal flashed in the corner of my vision, and I saw him wipe a bloody handprint on the wall where we turned to follow the architect. But why bother with riches at all if you're going to bury it under dust and rotsbane? I matched my step with the architect's so that he no longer had reason to turn back and possibly see Davin marking the path to the exit.
"Sometimes it's less about owning something and more about keeping it from someone else."
The architect straightened his robes as he continued to stride forward.
"This particular trove was taken from the Grand Baron's cousin after he tried to take the barony for himself."
I'd heard all this already when the architect had first come to our home in search of a skullbreaker. Davin always played the part of the thief for hire so well, and I was always careful to listen in and catch every detail of a job. But as much as I detested the sound of the architect's slimy, self-important voice, I needed to keep his focus on me. "Are the riches at the labyrinth center worth your reputation, though?" I asked. When the architect gave me a furrowed brow in response, I clarified. "The Grand Baron hired you to design a vault no one would be able to break into. But we're breaking in. Everyone will know your design failed." His paunchy cheeks turned red, and he tried to stammer out a response, but resorted to saving face by pretending to rub a smudge from the tinted glasses of his goggles.
"My labyrinth is performing just how I designed it. The Baron needs safe passage to his treasures, after all. A single wrong turn, and any other trespasser would perish in one of the dozens of traps I've laid within this maze. If anyone's reputation is to be damaged, it'll be those of the magicians who formed the doorways that your husband will be skull-breaking." We took another turn, but found a dead end. For a moment, I braced for whatever traps the architect had warned would be waiting at every wrong turn.
But then I felt the telltale buzzing in my fingers that signaled a skull construct. I turned back to give Davin a meaningful look, and he caught on quick. Speaking of doorways... His low voice rumbled, and he made a show of cracking his knuckles. Let me through. I leaned against the wall as he pretended to work, and I pressed my hand against the gray stone. There was indeed another door hiding here. Its shape reverberated through my fingers, electrifying my every fiber with its residual magic. Hero shifted in her wrap, and I wondered if she could feel the magic too. It was a rare ability, skull-breaking. The idea that maybe Hero had inherited the skill made me feel closer to her than I had since she'd been born. Maybe she wasn't such a stranger after all. Come now, Skullbreaker, the architect hissed behind me. We still have far to travel before we reach the vault, and I'd like to be out of here before daybreak. I refocused my efforts, and the tingling in my fingers strengthened. It was easier to work without a rotsbane bearing down on us, and this door was less fortified. The magic only resisted a little bit. The stone turned translucent, and we passed through like ghosts. The architect had to light a new flame in the trough carved into the walls, but the white fire revealed another corridor of gray stone. Like I said, the architect hastened his pace to lead the way towards the first turn. I'd like to make this quick. We carried on like that for longer than I'd hoped. I would distract the architect, usually by getting him to talk about himself, while Davin marked our way out with his bloodied palm. Progress was hindered every now and then by hidden doors that needed skull breaking, and each one buckled beneath my touch. I was starting to believe that we'd be meandering through the labyrinth forever, listening to the architect prattle on about his supposed accolades and accomplishments, when a new sound mingled with that of his voice. At first, I thought it might be water, but the sound was too light and too slippery. It whispered more than it roared, and the pale glow that emanated from around the next corner brought my heart into my throat. I hurried ahead of the architect to take the turn. I'd never seen so much raw skull in one place. It swirled below me, forming a moat around a massive stone column that sat like an island in the middle of the skull-filled cavern. Streams of glowing liquid poured from grates in the structure to add to the river of skull, and the light of the pool reached up to the highest recesses of the cavern, dancing along the stone roof like sunshine shifting through water. Davin's low whistle sounded behind me, and he rested a heavy hand on my shoulder. We'll never have to take another job again with all this skull, he whispered. The idea was both elating and terrifying. We aren't done yet. The architect smacked his lips as he downed more skull from the bottle at his belt. That island there, that's the vault. Stand back. For all his talk he'd bored me with through the twists and turns of the labyrinth, the architect proved a lackluster magician. Burgundy light poured from his hands, twisting in the air to form a simple bridge between us and the vault. As flashy as it looked, the skull that floated on the air and tickled my skin told me the bridge was made of a weak will. The bridge maintained its reddish-brown glow as it settled into place. When I went to test its integrity, Davin pulled me back. I'll go first, he murmured and settled a hand against Hero's head as he maneuvered forward. I held my breath as the bridge took his weight, but he flashed me an assured grin. Don't worry. The architect put his hand against my waist to step around me and follow Davin. I wouldn't risk my skullbreaker this close to my prize. I assure you my construct is perfectly capable of bearing us safely across the cavern. I placed a hand over Hero's back and stepped onto the bridge. It felt sturdier underfoot than I expected, and I hurried after the men, eager to get into the vault, collect my skull, and go home. The moat swirled and glowed beneath me. It was ethereal. It was priceless. It was dangerous. It wasn't that skull was difficult to swim in. Its low density made it impossible. It would be a beautiful way to go, though, surrounded by that soft blue glow. I imagined it would be like drowning in starlight. Runa! Davin's voice brought me to attention, and I realized I was standing stationary at the center of the bridge, staring down into the swirling skull with my hand still over Hero's back. I staggered backwards, away from the edge, and jogged the rest of the way across, ignoring the ache in my legs and abdomen. David and the architect waited on a stone shelf that jutted out from the vault, and the architect ran greedy fingers over the barren wall ahead of us. Waves of magic energy rolled off the rock face, and while the men didn't seem to notice how it electrified the air, Hero squirmed in her wrap again. "We're so close," the architect murmured, and then shot David a commanding glare. "Open it!" David drew in a heavy breath that I knew was mostly for show, and then pressed his palms against the stone. I leaned against the wall next to him and let the elaborate network of skull magic pull me into its tangled mess. This door was much more complex than those we'd encountered within the maze. It didn't just resist my skull breaking, it fought back. Energy shot through my fingers, burning my skin, and I lurched away from the wall. Hero fought against the wrap that held her against my chest, and her shrill cry echoed against the glistening cavern walls. "Runa!" David reached to steady me, but I shook my head at him. "What's happened?" The architect glared at us, but I ignored him. "Take Hero," I murmured, already undoing the tie on the wrap. I had no doubts now. The tiny newborn could feel the skull magic too. She would be a skullbreaker. "But it's hurting her." Hero looked so tiny in David's large hands, and he held her against his chest in an effort to calm her cries. It was strange that someone so small had felt so heavy. Not heavy in a physical way, of course. Heavy in a different sense of the word. Heavy in a way that made me feel like I was being crushed and squeezed at the core of my being. Maybe I had been that heavy too, when I had been 5 weeks old. My mother had been dead for several years, but I suddenly found myself wondering if she had been someone else before she'd had me, or if the weight of me had changed her into someone she didn't recognize. Did every woman die when they brought forth new life? And if so, why had no one warned me that would happen? "Would the child not be better tended to by its mother?" the architect hissed. "Skullbreaker!" I pressed my palms against the wall again, this time bracing for the onslaught. The skull magic that made up the door lashed out, but I attacked back. "You will bend to me," I told it. "You will break." Fire burned through my veins, up my arms. The stone in front of me glowed bright enough to swallow my hands in its light, and I closed my eyes against the blaze. The fire seared inside my head, and I felt like I was being turned inside out. I screamed in pain, and somewhere behind me, David screamed too. I'd heard of this before. Skullbreakers who were undone by the obstacles they sought to deconstruct. I could feel it. A bit of the thread that made me who I was loosened here, a part of me unknotted there. I was flaking away. It felt so very much like becoming a mother. But I had so far survived that. I had survived 5 weeks in a body I didn't recognize, running on little to no sleep, keeping a tiny stranger alive and fed and warm. A tiny stranger that I had torn myself open to bring into this world. A tiny stranger who would be a skullbreaker like her mother. I had not done all that just to be brought to heel by the will of one of the Grand Baron's second-rate magicians. The burning in my head subsided just a little bit, and I resharpened my focus. I refused to be undone. I would not let the Runa I remembered being die. I would make sure the tiny, heavy stranger in David's arms knew me as both her mother and as the woman I had always been. Headstrong, troublemaker, fearless, skullbreaker. The skull's will broke beneath my hands, and the entire wall fell away in a dazzling array of burnt-up magic. After being in the skull-lit cavern, the space inside the vault felt dark and oppressive. A slab of stone sat at the center of the room. Its smooth surface caved inwards like a bowl,
and pale blue Skal bubbled upwards to fill the dip and spill over the stone sides. Metal grates protected the gutters that carried the Skal to the vault's edges, where it disappeared through drains to join the river of Skal outside. While the architect's promise of a Skal spring in the vault proved true, the treasure he'd come searching for was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the dull light afforded by the spring glanced off a haphazard stack of books, a wooden wardrobe, and a bed in a far corner piled high with quilts. It wasn't a vault after all, but a bedroom. "You've been playing me!" Swollen fingers pulled at the collar of my tunic and slammed me against the wall of the room. Davin roared in anger, but I struck out against the architect before my husband could come to my aid. I spun him to the floor, his yellow robes flying around him. Before I could strike again, however, a burgundy sword made of Skal formed in his hand, and he held it aloft in defense. "You're a witch and a liar," he seethed. "I didn't hire you. You hired a Skalbreaker, and that's what I did." I stepped around him to cross to the spring at the room's center. "Davin, the water skein, please." Davin stepped forward as he slipped the leather pouch from his back and returned Hero to my arms. She'd fallen back into a tentative sleep, and I retied my wrap to tuck her against my chest. "I hired him! I was almost ripped apart by a rotsbane because you could barely get that first door open." The architect staggered to his feet, still holding his glowing blade of magic. "Our deal is off. Neither of you get Skal." He swung his sword at Davin, but I stepped between them to catch the blade in my hand. The architect's will broke in my palm, and the sword evaporated. He gawked at me, his empty hand outstretched, as if still holding the sword that had existed until a moment ago. "Grab your treasure, architect," I said. "I want to go home." "Runa?" Davin's low voice held a warning, and I spun around in search of whatever danger he was trying to bring to my attention. I thought the dim light might be playing tricks on Davin, because the vault was just as empty as it had been when we'd first entered. But then I saw the wild mane of hair that framed wide, scared eyes, half hiding behind the mountain of quilts on the bed. The Grand Baron's treasure wasn't gold or jewels or weapons. It was a girl, no older than 13, cowering in a nightrobe. "What is this?" I turned back to the architect, and a greasy smile parted his lips. "My treasure." He strode across the room towards the girl, and she ducked farther behind her blankets. "Did Uncle change his mind?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, and I wondered when the last she'd used it had been. "Do I get to go home?" I remembered what the architect had said about the Grand Baron stealing from his cousin for trying to usurp him. Locking away the man's only child was one hell of a punishment. "Something like that." The architect's voice dripped with poison, and the girl pressed against the stone wall. Wild red ringlets flew around her face as she shook her head, but the architect lunged and took her by her emaciated wrist. He yanked her from the bed, and her bare feet slapped against the stone floor. "Oh, don't look at me like that," the architect snarled at me. "I'll give her a far better life than the one her uncle has promised her down here. Wouldn't you rather her grow up under my protection than in a vault, subsisting off of nothing but Skal, never seeing the sun, never feeling the company of another person?" I placed a hand over Hero. In 13 years, she'd look like the girl in front of me, just as I had 13 years ago. Jade light emanated from Davin's hands, and a glowing spear of Skal magic lengthened ahead of him. It was an intimidating weapon, but it gave away what I loved most about my husband. He was not a fighter. As a fisherman, he'd armed himself with the only tool he knew. "Let them go," I said softly, and a gentle touch of my fingers against the spear made the weapon dissolve. "He's an old man," Davin's voice cracked. "Runa, she's so young." I stepped aside, a hand still over Hero. "She's better off outside of this prison." I gave him a look, and his thick eyebrows furrowed. The architect laughed to himself as he passed, and the girl stared at me with scared, watery eyes. She shook her head in a silent plea,
but the architect was pulling her forward towards the doors and the bridge of Skal that still stretched across the cavern. "Take your Skal, despite your trickery," the architect said, stepping out onto his bridge. "And I'll take my treasure. We all get our happily ever after." Men didn't like hiring women for mercenary jobs, whether it was skull-breaking, assassinations, or generalized thievery. They thought being women made us soft. We were built to be mothers. We were designed for nurturing, not stealing, taking, and killing. I patted Hero's head. Those men were wrong, because it was the mother in me that made it so easy to be ruthless. "Our happily ever afters?" I repeated and followed them to the ledge outside the vault. "I suppose you're right. Davin?" Davin, always perceptive and forever knowing the silent messages I instilled in my glances to him, lunged forward. His strong hands wrapped around the girl's bicep as the architect led her out onto the bridge. My thumb stroked the peachy fuzz of Hero's hair. The architect's will was so weak, so brittle, that I didn't even have to touch his bridge to shatter it beneath his feet. The girl swung backwards into Davin's arms, while the architect hung in the air, lost in the falling folds of his yellow robes. He screamed a curse at me, and his jowls rushed up around his face as he fell. The swirling Skal below swallowed him with a whispering ripple. Flashes of burgundy sputtered in the glowing depth as the architect scrambled to construct something, anything that might save him. But after a moment, the flashes ceased and the Skal's surface stilled. The girl clung to Davin, and Skal light reflected in her eyes as she stared at the spot where the architect had disappeared. "Davin, I think we may need a new bridge," I said. "I think you might be right." Davin pulled the girl away from the ledge, and the air crackled with his Skal magic. It was less of a buzz against my skin and more of a warm tickle as an impressive bridge of glowing jade settled into place. "How's that?" "It's beautiful." I held a hand out to the girl. "It's a bit of a walk home. I hope you don't mind." She shook her head. "Have you a name?" I asked, my hand still outstretched. "Lavinia," she whispered. "Lavinia." I nodded. She couldn't go back to her family. They'd lock her back up in their vault. This girl was a stranger to me. But so was the baby on my chest, and so was I in so many ways these days. My family had room for one more stranger. "I'm Runa. That's my husband Davin. And this is Hero." Davin grunted a hello as he loaded our Skal skeins onto his back. Lavinia looked from me to my hand and then to Hero. Her freckled cheeks, shallow and pale, broke into a tentative smile. "Should we go home?" I asked. With a nod, she finally took my hand in hers. "Yes, please." Davin came up on my other side, carrying enough skeins, pouches, and bottles of Skal to make us the richest household in Riverstead, and we struck out across the Bridge of Jade as a newly minted family of strangers together. This has been Skalbroken by M.T. Zimny, narrated by Elizabeth Phillips, and originally published in the Blades for Hire anthology. Discover more about the world of SKALTERRA in M.T. Zimny's SKALTERRA by Nightmare.